Chapter 161. The sun rose over Bogotá, casting long shadows across the government palace as the Gran Colombia Republic's ministers gathered again, this time in President Mariano Velázquez's private chamber. The room smelled faintly of ink and parchment, with stacks of letters, reports, and diplomatic missives spread across a large oak table. Foreign Minister Felipe Ortega was hunched over his work, penning the final draft of the formal protest to the Amorathian government. The room was quiet except for the occasional scrape of his pen and the muffled footsteps of aides delivering fresh documents. Velázquez stood by the window, staring out at the city as if lost in thought. He finally broke the silence. "Ortega, how soon can you have the letter ready?" "Within the hour, Mr. President," Ortega replied, not looking up from his work. "I've taken into account our position and the tone you request firm but not outright hostile. The message will demand an explanation and insist on the withdrawal of Amorathian forces from Panama, but it leaves room for negotiation." Velázquez nodded, still looking out the window. "Good. Send a copy to our ambassadors in Europe. We need to make sure the world knows Amorathia is violating our sovereignty. This isn't just our fight, it's about setting a precedent." General Rodrigo Ibarra, seated across the room, leaned forward. "And if the Amorathians ignore it? What then?" Velázquez turned, his expression cold and measured. "Then we respond as necessary, but only when the time is right. The last thing we need is to rush into a fight we're not prepared for." Ibarra frowned but said nothing, his frustration evident. He had never been a man to wait for an enemy to strike first. "Mr. President," Ortega said, straightening as he finished the letter, "the draft is complete. Would you like to review it before I send it?" Velázquez walked over and picked up the letter, scanning its contents. The language was careful, the tone assertive without being inflammatory. Satisfied, he handed it back. "It'll do. Send it immediately and ensure it reaches Amorathia's ambassador by the end of the day." Ortega stood and bowed slightly. "Consider it done." While the diplomatic efforts were underway, General Ibarra wasted no time in reinforcing Gran Colombia's military presence near the Panamanian border. Troop convoys moved through the narrow mountain passes, their banners flying high. Villagers along the route watched silently as soldiers marched past, their faces a mixture of curiosity and concern. Ibarra himself inspected the garrisons, ensuring they were fortified and well supplied. At one of the larger forts overlooking a strategic valley, he addressed a gathering of officers. "Amorathia may claim to be here for peace," he said, his voice steady but loud enough to carry across the courtyard, "but make no mistake, they are here to take what is ours. We may not strike first, but if they push us, we will push back harder." The officers nodded in agreement, their faces grim. Ibarra knew his troops were outnumbered and outgunned, but he also knew that morale would play a critical role in the conflict, should it come to that. Days later, the Amorathian ambassador in Bogotá received the formal protest from Gran Colombia. It was a crisp document, sealed with the presidential emblem, and its contents left no room for misinterpretation. The ambassador, a tall man with a diplomatic smile that rarely reached his eyes, read the letter. "On behalf of the Gran Colombia Republic, I must express our government's grave concern and outright disapproval of your recent actions in Panama. The deployment of Amorathian troops and your nation's overt support for the Panamanian independence movement represent a clear violation of our sovereignty and territorial integrity. While we understand the importance of fostering global trade and economic cooperation, your incursion into Panamanian territory is an affront to the principles of national independence and respect for international borders. Gran Colombia has governed Panama as an integral part of our republic, and we cannot condone interference from external powers. We demand the immediate withdrawal of all Amorathian forces from Panamanian soil and a cessation of all material and political support to the rebels. Furthermore, we request that your government provide an explanation for this incursion and its long-term intentions in the region. Failure to comply with these demands will force us to consider all options available to defend our nation's sovereignty. Gran Colombia does not seek conflict, but we will not hesitate to defend our people and our land. We trust that the Amorathian Republic will reconsider its actions and choose diplomacy over escalation." Discover stories at Novelbin. Calm sincerely, President Mariano Velázquez, Gran Colombia Republic. The Amorathian ambassador set the letter down, his expression unchanging. "Draft a response." He instructed his aide. "Acknowledgement of their message, but no concessions. Amorathia's stance must remain firm." "Understood, sir," the aide replied, picking up a pen. The ambassador leaned back in his chair, deep in thought. He knew this letter would be followed by tension, perhaps even an escalation. The stakes in Panama were higher than they appeared on the surface, and the world was watching. Meanwhile, Gran Colombia's efforts to bolster its border defenses were met with logistical challenges. Supply lines were stretched thin, and the troops deployed to the Panamanian frontier faced rough terrain, unpredictable weather, and limited resources. General Ibarra personally oversaw the fortification of key positions along the border. At one remote outpost, he stood with a group of officers, studying a map of the region spread across a rough wooden table. "This is where the Amarathians are likely to concentrate their efforts," Ibarra said, pointing to the area near Colón. "It's close to the canal route, and they'll want to secure it quickly. We need to make sure they can't advance beyond this point." One of the younger officers, Captain Vargas, spoke up. "General, with all due respect, do we have enough men to hold this position if they attack? Their forces are far better equipped than ours." Ibarra's jaw tightened. "We may be outnumbered, but we have the advantage of knowing this terrain. If it comes to a fight, we'll make them pay for every inch they try to take." The officers exchanged uneasy glances but nodded in agreement. Chapter 162. The sun hung high over the Panamanian jungle, its rays filtering through the dense canopy as Matthew Hesh and his wife, Amber, led a small group of engineers and advisors to the proposed site of the Panama Canal, armed with maps, surveying tools, and an unshakable determination. The group moved along uneven trails, occasionally swatting at the ever-present mosquitoes. Amber walked beside Matthew, holding a wide-brimmed hat to shield her face from the oppressive heat. Her eyes scanned the terrain, a mix of curiosity and skepticism evident in her expression. "Your next read awaits at Novelbin." Calm. "So, this is where it's all going to happen?" she asked, gesturing at the lush greenery and rolling hills around them. Matthew nodded, stopping to adjust his map. "This is it. The proposed canal route will stretch from the Caribbean Sea over there." He pointed to the north, to the Pacific Ocean on the other side. Once completed, ships will be able to bypass the entire southern tip of South America. Amber glanced at the thick forest and the steep slopes that lined parts of the path. "I can't help but wonder, why are we using locks? Couldn't we just dig a straight canal like they did with the Suez Canal?" Matthew smiled, setting the map aside. "It's a good question, and a lot of people asked the same thing when the French tried to build this canal years ago. But the terrain here is completely different from the Suez. The Suez Canal runs through flat, sandy desert. Here in Panama, we're dealing with mountains, rivers, and a lot of rainfall." Amber raised an eyebrow. "So the locks are necessary because of the elevation?" "Exactly," Matthew said, gesturing to a nearby ridge. "The land between the oceans isn't level. There's about an 85-foot difference in elevation at the highest point. If we tried to dig a straight canal at sea level, we'd have to cut through mountains, and the constant rainfall would cause landslides. It's just not practical." Amber nodded, her curiosity growing. "And the locks?" "The locks will act like water elevators," Matthew explained. "Ships will enter a lock chamber and will raise or lower the water level to move them up or down, depending on which direction they're going. It's a lot more efficient than trying to level the entire route." "That makes sense," Amber said, stepping closer to inspect the uneven ground, "but it also sounds like a huge challenge. How are you going to manage all of this?" Matthew chuckled. "That's why we brought in the best engineers. Bellamont and Lachance have already started refining the designs, and we've got teams working on detailed surveys. Plus, Hesh Industries is manufacturing specialized equipment to handle the tough conditions." As they continued their inspection, the group paused by a clearing overlooking a wide river. Bellamont, the lead engineer, knelt by the water's edge, sketching in his notebook. "This will likely be one of the lock sites," he said. Pointing to the natural contours of the land, "the river can be redirected to fill the chambers." Amber watched as Bellamont explained the process to a group of workers, her respect for the team's expertise growing. "It's incredible to think how much thought and planning goes into something like this," she said to Matthew. Matthew nodded. "It's a massive undertaking. But it's worth it. This canal will change the world." Amber, "ITLL cut shipping times by weeks, save costs, and open up new trade routes, and ITLL bring opportunities to the people of Panama." Amber smiled, but before she could respond, one of the advisors approached Matthew, his expression tense. "Mr. Hesh, we have a situation." Matthew's brow furrowed. "What kind of situation?" The advisor pointed toward the trail they had taken earlier. "Gran Colombian soldiers, a whole patrol of them. They've crossed into the area, and they're demanding to speak with whoever's in charge." Matthew exchanged a glance with Amber, his jaw tightening. "Where are they now?" They're near the edge of the site, about half a mile back. The advisor said the Amarathian troops stationed here are holding them off, but it's tense. Amber's expression grew concerned. Matthew, this could escalate quickly. I know, Matthew said, his tone calm but firm. Stay here with Belle Lamont and the others. I'll go see what's going on. I'm coming with you, Amber said, her voice leaving no room for argument. Matthew hesitated, but seeing the determination in her eyes, he nodded. Fine, but stay close and let me handle the talking. The two of them, along with the advisor, hurried toward the commotion. As they approached, the sounds of raised voices became clear. A group of Grand Colombian soldiers, their uniforms dusty from the journey, stood in a tense standoff with a line of Amarathian troops. Both sides had their hands on their weapons, though no one had drawn yet. At the center of the Grand Colombian group was a man who appeared to be their leader. His sharp features and commanding presence setting him apart. He stepped forward as Matthew approached, his eyes narrowing. Are you the one in charge here? He demanded in Spanish. Matthew nodded, raising his hands in a gesture of calm. I'm Matthew Hesh from Amarathia, and you are? Captain Alejandro Ramirez, the man replied, and this land belongs to Gran Colombia. You have no right to be here. Matthew kept his tone measured. Captain Ramirez, we're here to work with the Panamanian people to build a canal that will benefit the entire region. We're not here to claim territory or cause trouble. You're supporting a rebellion, Ramirez shot back. That is trouble. The tension in the air was palpable. Amarathian soldiers stood firm, their eyes locked on the Colombians. Ramirez's men mirrored their stance, their hands inching closer to their weapons. Amber stepped forward slightly, her voice steady but firm. Captain, we understand your concerns, but violence won't solve anything. Let's find a way to discuss this without conflict. Ramirez's gaze flicked to Amber, his expression softening slightly before returning to Matthew. This is your warning, Mr. Hesh. If your Amarathian forces continue to occupy Panamanian territory, Gran Colombia will respond. You have no right to be here. Matthew took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. Captain, I understand your position, but we're not here to fight. Let's take this back to our governments and let them handle it diplomatically. There's no need for bloodshed. Ramirez studied him for a long moment before nodding curtly. Very well, but don't mistake this for weakness. We'll be watching. With that, he signaled his men to fall back. The tension eased as the Grand Colombian soldiers disappeared into the jungle, but the message was clear. This was far from over. Matthew turned to the Amarathian officer in charge. Good work keeping things from escalating. Let's stay alert. This won't be the last time they show up. The officer nodded. Understood, Mr. Hesh. Well, keep a close watch. As Matthew and Amber walked back to the inspection site, Amber glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. That could have gone very badly. It still might, Matthew said quietly. This project was never going to be easy, Amber, but we'll find a way to make it work. She slipped her hand into his, her grip firm. And you won't have to do it alone. Matthew gave her a small smile, but his thoughts remained on the challenges ahead. The Panama Canal was a project of immense promise, but it was becoming increasingly clear that the path to completion would be anything but smooth. Chapter 163. The oppressive heat of the Panamanian jungle seemed heavier in the days following the tense standoff with Captain Ramirez and his Grand Colombian soldiers. Despite the uneasy truce, the atmosphere on site grew more charged. Amarathian troops remained vigilant, their presence a steady reassurance to the workers and engineers laboring to prepare the canal's construction. But the tension that lingered after Ramirez's warning was undeniable. Matthew Hesh and his team pressed on, unwilling to let fear stall their progress. Surveying teams moved deeper into the jungle, marking potential lock sites and clearing paths for future excavation. Amber continued her efforts alongside Matthew, organizing logistics and ensuring the workers had what they needed. The project felt monumental, but the shadow of conflict loomed larger every day. One sweltering afternoon, just as the workers began to break for lunch, a commotion erupted near the camp's western edge. Shouts carried through the thick air, followed by the sound of horses and the sharp bark of orders in Spanish. Matthew, who had been reviewing maps with Belle Lamont, immediately straightened. What's going on? Amber asked, already on her feet. Matthew didn't hesitate. Stay here, I'll find out. No, Amber said firmly, grabbing her wide-brimmed hat. I'm coming with you. Realizing there was no point in arguing, Matthew nodded, and the two hurried toward the source of the disturbance. As they approached, they saw a group of Grand Colombian soldiers on horseback surrounding a cluster of frightened workers and surveyors. The soldiers barked orders, their rifles slung casually over their shoulders but held in a way that made their threat clear. Matthew's stomach sank as he pushed through the crowd of Amarathian guards and workers. He raised his hands, keeping his voice calm but firm. "What is the meaning of this?" One of the soldiers, a younger man with a scar running down his cheek, sneered. "These men," he gestured to the workers, "are trespassing on Grand Colombian land. We are here to escort them off." Matthew's jaw tightened. "This land is not your territory. Panama is under the governance of the Panamanian people, and these workers are here as part of an agreed effort to develop this region. Your interference is unwarranted." The soldier's expression hardened. "Your so-called agreement means nothing. We warned you to leave, and yet here you are now. We will take these men with us." Behind the soldiers, Matthew spotted 3 foreign engineers, men from Europe who had joined the project for their expertise being held at gunpoint. One of them, a Frenchman named Armand, looked particularly distressed as he pleaded with the soldiers in broken Spanish. "Let them go," Matthew demanded, his voice sharp. "You have no authority to detain anyone here." The soldier with the scar laughed coldly. "Authority? You think your Amarathian guards can protect you? They cannot stop us. We will make an example of these trespassers. Amber, call the troops now," Matthew ordered. Amber didn't hesitate. She turned and ran toward the central camp where the Amarathian soldiers were stationed. Matthew, his heart pounding, stepped closer to the Grand Colombian soldiers, his arms raised in a placating gesture. "Let's not escalate this," he said, his voice steady but firm. "These are innocent workers and engineers. They're here to build, not fight." The soldier with the scar sneered. "Innocent? They're trespassers aiding a rebellion. They'll answer for their actions." The surrounding workers, visibly terrified, whispered among themselves. Some tried to inch backward, but the soldiers quickly barked orders to keep them in place. Matthew's eyes flicked toward Armand, who was trembling, the barrel of a rifle still pointed at him. The tension broke when the sound of boots thudding against the jungle floor reached the clearing. Captain Hayes, leading a contingent of Amarathian troops, stormed into view. Their rifles were raised and their expressions were grim. Amber followed close behind, her face flushed from exertion. "Stand down," Hayes barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. "This area is under Amarathian protection. Release the workers immediately." The Grand Colombian soldiers shifted uncomfortably, their hands twitching near their weapons. Captain Ramirez, who had apparently arrived unnoticed, stepped forward from the shadows, his expression icy. "You're making a mistake, Captain," Ramirez said coldly. Addressing Hayes, "These men are criminals on sovereign Grand Colombian soil. We are within our rights to detain them." "This is Panamanian territory," Hayes shot back, "and any attempt to harm or kidnap civilians under our protection will be considered an act of aggression. Do you want to start a war here and now? How many times must I repeat myself? There is no Panamanian territory. There is only Grand Colombia. Your so-called independence movement is nothing more than a farce fueled by foreign interference." His words drew murmurs from his soldiers, their grips tightening on their rifles. Behind him, one of the younger soldiers nervously shifted his weight, glancing at his comrades for reassurance. Captain Hayes didn't flinch, his posture as rigid as steel. "Your opinions don't change the reality on the ground. Amarathia recognizes Panama's sovereignty, and we are here to protect its people and ensure the safety of this project. If you or your men take one step further, you'll be the one escalating this into something neither of us can control." The two captains stared each other down, their words cutting deeper with each exchange. The workers and engineers huddled nearby, trembling with fear. Matthew, standing between the groups, raised his hands again in a desperate attempt to defuse the situation. "Gentlemen," Matthew said, his voice loud and clear, "there is nothing to gain from violence here. Let's all take a step back and talk this through. We're not enemies, we're just men trying to do our jobs." Ramirez's jaw tightened as he turned his cold gaze to Matthew. "You may speak of peace, Mr. Hesh, but your actions are anything but peaceful. You bring foreign soldiers onto our land, build fortifications, and claim to be working for Panama's benefit. All I see is another nation trying to carve up what doesn't belong to them. Find exclusive stories on Novelbin." Calm Amber stepped forward, her voice steady but strained. "Captain Ramirez, if this canal is completed, it will benefit everyone in the region, including Grand Colombia. No one here wants war. Why can't we focus on the potential for cooperation instead of conflict?" Ramirez's eyes flickered toward Amber, a brief flash of something unreadable crossing his face. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, one of his younger soldiers, his nerves clearly frayed, stepped forward, his rifle shaking in his hands. "This is all a trap," the young soldier shouted, his voice cracking. "They're here to take everything from us. The sudden outburst drew the attention of everyone in the clearing. Hayes' men tensed, their rifles aimed but still undischarged. Ramirez turned sharply to his soldier, his face darkening with fury. "Stand down, Private!" Ramirez barked, his voice like thunder. "You will not act without orders." But it was too late. The soldier, his fear overtaking reason, gritted his teeth and raised his rifle higher, the barrel now pointing directly at one of the Amarathian guards. "No one takes what belongs to Gran Colombia!" The young soldier screamed as his finger twitched on the trigger. The crack of a gunshot split the air. Chapter 164. Time seemed to freeze as the first shot rang out, echoing through the jungle. Then, chaos erupted. Amarathian soldiers dove for cover, their rifles snapping into action as they responded to the threat. Ramirez shouted orders to his men, his voice drowned out by the cacophony of gunfire. Workers scattered, scrambling to escape the crossfire, while Matthew grabbed Amber and pulled her behind a thick tree for protection. "Stay down," Matthew shouted over the din, his heart pounding in his chest. Amber clutched his arm, her face pale but determined. "Matthew, what do we do?" "We wait it out," Matthew yelled, peering around the tree to assess the situation. "Hayes will try to contain this before it spirals out of control." The clearing had devolved into chaos. Gran Colombian soldiers, emboldened by the initial shot, fired sporadically at the Amarathians, while Hayes troops returned fire with disciplined precision. Several workers and engineers who had been too slow to escape lay flat on the ground, covering their heads and praying for the gunfire to stop. Ramirez, furious, grabbed the young soldier who had fired the first shot and yanked him backward. "You fool! Do you realize what you've done?" he bellowed. The young soldier stammered an incoherent reply, his face a mask of terror as he realized the magnitude of his actions. Ramirez shoved him aside and tried to rally his men, shouting for them to fall back, but the momentum of the skirmish was too strong. His orders were drowned out by the chaos. Hayes, crouched behind a fallen log, barked commands to his troops. "Hold your fire unless they advance. Do not escalate. Keep the workers safe." One of the Amarathian sergeants crawled over to Hayes, his face grim. "Captain, we're holding them off, but they're not retreating. If this continues, we'll have casualties." Hayes' jaw clenched as he considered his options. "We need to break their momentum. Fire a warning shot above their heads, something loud enough to remind them what they're up against." Hayes nodded grimly at the sergeant, his voice sharp as he barked out the order. "Grenadiers, launch a flare above their position. Let's remind them of our capabilities." The designated soldier scrambled into position, loading the rifle grenade with practiced efficiency. Moments later, a deafening thud sent the explosive skyward. It detonated in the canopy above the Gran Colombian troops, raining debris and light down onto the battlefield. For a split second, the jungle was illuminated in blinding red and orange, and the fighting paused as both sides instinctively ducked for cover. But the respite was short-lived. "Hold your positions," Ramirez roared, his face twisted with rage. His men, rattled but determined, responded with renewed aggression. Several opened fire again, bullets whizzing dangerously close to the Amarathian soldiers. "All units, return fire," Hayes bellowed, realizing the situation had spiraled beyond containment. The Amarathian troops, trained for precision and discipline, unleashed hails of bullets aimed at suppressing the Gran Colombian advance. The sound of gunfire thundered through the jungle, shaking the earth beneath their feet. The clearing quickly transformed into a war zone. Trees splintered as bullets tore through the dense jungle, and the acrid stench of gunpowder filled the air. Workers and engineers, caught in the crossfire, scrambled to safer positions behind rocks and hastily constructed barriers. Some shouted prayers, while others simply covered their heads, their faces pale with terror. Amber clung tightly to Matthew, who kept her pressed against the thick tree trunk. "Stay low," he ordered, his voice barely audible over the chaos. He glanced around, searching for any sign of an opening to retreat to safety, but the sheer ferocity of the battle left little room to maneuver. Meanwhile, Ramirez pressed forward, barking orders to his men to flank the Amarathian positions. "Move to the left. Pin them down. Show them that Gran Colombia will not be intimidated." Hayes, observing the maneuver, quickly issued a countercommand: "Cover the left flank. Don't let them gain ground." The Amarathian soldiers responded with precision, redirecting their fire to halt the encroaching Grand Colombians. A series of well-placed shots forced Ramirez's men to retreat behind the cover of fallen trees and dense underbrush, temporarily halting their advance. Yet the skirmish showed no signs of letting up. In the chaos, an Amarathian corporal spotted a group of workers pinned down near the center of the clearing. "Captain Hayes," he shouted, "we've got civilians trapped out there. Your next chapter awaits on Novelbin." Hayes turned, his face grim. "Sergeant Mallory, take your squad and get them out of there. Cover their retreat." Mallory nodded, signaling to his men. They advanced in a low crouch, moving with precision and shielding the workers with their bodies as they guided them back towards safer ground. A volley of gunfire from the Grand Colombians sent one soldier sprawling, clutching his leg, but the squad managed to extract the workers with minimal casualties. Amber, watching the daring rescue, turned to Matthew. "We have to help them. They can't do this alone." Matthew shook his head, his face pale but resolute. "There's nothing we can do right now, Amber. Would only make things worse." Back on the Grand Colombian side, Ramirez snarled as he surveyed the battlefield. His initial strategy was failing, and the Amarathians' disciplined response was keeping his forces pinned down. He turned to one of his lieutenants. "Bring up the mortars. If they want to play this game, well, make them regret it." The lieutenant hesitated. "Captain, the cannons? That could escalate this into do it." Ramirez snapped. "We're past diplomacy now. If they want to hold this land, they'll pay for it." Moments later, two soldiers lugging portable mortars appeared on the field. They quickly set up their equipment under Ramirez's direction, aiming toward the Amarathian positions. Hayes noticed the movement and his blood ran cold. "Cannons," he muttered. "They're about to shell us." "Captain, what's the call?" one of his officers asked, panic flickering in his eyes. Hayes gritted his teeth, his mind racing. "Snipers, take out those cannon teams. Everyone else, hold steady. We need to neutralize them before they can fire." The crack of sniper rifles split the air, and one of the Grand Colombian mortar operators collapsed, clutching his chest. The other quickly ducked for cover, but Ramirez barked an order for his men to provide suppressing fire, forcing the Amarathian snipers to pull back temporarily. The surviving cannon operator adjusted his aim and fired a shell. It arced high into the air before crashing down near the Amarathian positions, sending a plume of dirt and shrapnel skyward. The explosion rattled the ground, and the soldiers closest to it were thrown off their feet. "Get those civilians out of here," Hayes yelled, his voice hoarse. "We can't hold this position if they keep shelling us." The gunfire reached a deafening crescendo as both sides dug in, neither willing to cede ground. Ramirez, emboldened by the mortar strike, ordered his men to press forward even as the Amarathians pushed back with equal determination. The clearing became a chaotic dance of smoke, blood, and fury. Matthew, still huddled with Amber behind the tree, clenched his fists. "This is expected. There will now be a war between Amarathia and Grand Columbia Republic." Chapter 165. The battlefield was engulfed in absolute chaos. The air was thick with smoke, gunpowder, and the acrid stench of burned vegetation. The relentless roar of gunfire filled the jungle, drowning out the desperate cries of soldiers and workers alike. Amarathian forces had entrenched themselves, and the advantage of their advanced weaponry was beginning to show. The Amarathian machine guns, positioned strategically along the defensive line, spat out streams of bullets at a rapid rate. Ramirez's men, despite their bravery, stood little chance against the sheer volume of firepower. Grand Colombian soldiers fell in waves, their bodies crumpling to the ground as they tried to advance or take cover. "Keep that fire steady," Hayes shouted, his voice cutting through the deafening noise. He gestured toward one of the machine gun nests. "Focus on their center. Don't let them regroup." The operators of the Amarathian machine guns nodded, their faces grim and covered in sweat. They shifted their aim, cutting down any Grand Colombian soldiers who dared to move out of cover. The rapid rattle of the guns was punctuated by the screams of men who realized too late they were exposed. On the Grand Colombian side, Ramirez was livid. He barked orders to his men, urging them to hold their ground. "Flank them. Use the trees for cover," he yelled, pointing toward the dense jungle to their right. "They can't hit what they can't see." A handful of Ramirez's soldiers broke off, attempting to maneuver through the jungle to outflank the Amarathians. However, Hayes had anticipated this move. "Snipers, watch the tree line," he ordered. "Take them out before they get close." The sharp crack of Amarathian sniper rifles echoed through the clearing. One by one, the flanking soldiers fell, their bodies collapsing into the undergrowth. Ramirez cursed under his breath, realizing his plan was failing. Behind the defensive line, Matthew kept Amber pressed against the tree trunk, shielding her from the carnage unfolding around them. His face was pale but determined. He knew this fight was quickly escalating into something far worse than a skirmish we need to get out of. Here, Amber, he said, his voice barely audible over the gunfire. It's not safe. Amber shook her head, her jaw set. I'm not leaving without you, and you're not going anywhere until this calms down. This isn't going to calm down, Matthew replied grimly, not with that Colombian general out there pushing his men to their deaths. Amber glanced around the clearing, her eyes wide with fear. How did it come to this? Well, this was the risk associated when building a project in a foreign country, Matthew simply explained. Back on the front line, the Amarathian soldiers were holding their ground. The combination of their machine guns and improved bolt-action rifles gave them a significant edge over the Grand Colombian forces, who were equipped with older, less reliable weaponry for every shot fired by the Grand Colombians. The Amarathians answered with 10, a young Amarathian private manning one of the machine guns gritted his teeth as he fired into the chaos. They just keep coming, he shouted to his partner, who was feeding ammunition into the gun. They'll break eventually, the other soldier replied, his voice strained. They have to. But Ramirez's men were desperate. Knowing they were outgunned, they began to use more reckless tactics. Several soldiers charged straight at the Amarathian positions, hoping to overwhelm them through sheer numbers. It was a suicidal move, and it ended predictably. The charging soldiers were cut down in seconds, their bodies falling in a heap just a few yards from the Amarathian line. Hayes watched the carnage with a grim expression. He knew his men were winning, but the cost of this fight was already too high. Keep firing, he ordered. Push them back. On the other side of the battlefield, Ramirez was running out of options. His forces were being decimated, and his men were beginning to lose their resolve. The mortar teams he had relied on earlier were either dead or pinned down. Unable to fire another shot, Captain, we can't hold this position, one of his lieutenants shouted, his face pale with fear. We need to retreat. No, Ramirez barked, his eyes blazing with anger. We do not retreat. We hold this ground, no matter the cost. But, Captain, I said no. Ramirez roared, cutting the man off. We cannot show weakness. If we retreat now, they will take everything. The lieutenant hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Understood, sir. Enjoy exclusive chapters from NovelBin. Calm Ramirez turned his attention back to the battlefield, his mind racing. He knew he was losing, but he refused to admit defeat. Rally the men, he shouted. Keep fighting. Well, drive them back. As the battle dragged on, the Amarathian forces began to push forward, their superior firepower overwhelming the Grand Colombians. Hayes, sensing that the tide had turned, decided to press the advantage. Advance, he ordered, signaling to his men. Take the fight to them. Push them out of the clearing. The Amarathian soldiers moved forward in coordinated groups, their rifles firing in controlled bursts. The Grand Colombian forces, already demoralized, began to fall back under the relentless assault. Ramirez, realizing his position was untenable, finally gave the order to retreat. Fall back, he shouted, his voice hoarse. Fall back to the jungle. The remaining Grand Colombian soldiers scrambled to obey, retreating into the dense foliage. The sound of gunfire gradually subsided as the Amarathians ceased their advance, allowing their enemies to flee. When the dust settled, the clearing was eerily silent. The ground was littered with spent shells, shattered trees, and the bodies of fallen soldiers. The Amarathian troops began to regroup, their faces grim as they took stock of their losses. Hayes approached Matthew and Amber, his uniform streaked with dirt and sweat. It's over, he said, his voice heavy. For now. Matthew nodded, his expression weary. But it's not the end, is it? No, Hayes admitted. This was just the beginning. Ramirez will be back, and next time, he won't come with just a patrol. Amber placed a hand on Matthew's arm, her eyes filled with worry. What do we do now? There will be a temporary pause in the construction of the canal, Matthew said. We are going to let our government handle this for the moment. Chapter 166. The sun was just beginning to rise over the Amarathian capital when President Theodore Clay was summoned to the Oval Office. His chief of staff, William Harrington, entered the room with a stack of documents and a grim expression that immediately caught Clay's attention. Mr. President, Harrington began, his voice steady but tense. We have a situation in Panama. Clay, still seated at his desk, set down the coffee he had been sipping and straightened. What kind of situation? He asked, his sharp blue eyes narrowing. Harrington handed him a brief. A skirmish, sir. Grand Colombian forces initiated an attack on our troops and workers near the canal site. It was a full-fledged assault, and while our forces managed to repel them, we suffered casualties, both military and civilian. Clay's jaw tightened as he scanned the report. How many? 5 dead, including 2 engineers, Harrington said grimly. Another dozen wounded. Clay slammed the folder shut and stood, pacing the room. Damn it! I knew this would happen the moment we committed to Panama. But an outright attack? This is an act of war. Harrington nodded. It's clear that Gran Colombia is unwilling to back down. Ramirez's forces retreated, but our intelligence suggests they're regrouping near the border. They're likely preparing for another strike. Clay stopped pacing and turned to Harrington, his voice low but firm. Get the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, and the Joint Chiefs in here now. We need to plan our next move. As Harrington left to summon the officials, Clay sat back down, his mind racing. The canal project had always been a gamble, but now it was threatening to spiral into a full-scale war. He knew the stakes were high not just for Amarathia, but for global trade and his administration's legacy. Meanwhile, in Bogotá, President Mariano Velázquez was locked in a similar state of outrage. The report of the failed assault reached him early in the morning, and the details only fueled his fury. They slaughtered our men? Velázquez growled, slamming his fist onto the table in his office. Dozens dead, and for what? To protect a rebellion that they instigated. General Rodrigo Ibarra, standing rigidly at attention, nodded. The Amarathians are far better equipped than we anticipated. Their machine guns and rifles outclass anything we have in the field. Velázquez's foreign minister, Felipe Ortega, cleared his throat. Mr. President, this incident will not go unnoticed by the international community. If we escalate this into an all-out war, we risk alienating potential allies. Discover hidden content at Novelbin. Calm. Velázquez turned to Ortega, his eyes blazing. And what do you propose? That we sit back and let Amarathia carve Panama out of our republic like a butcher slicing meat? No, Minister, we cannot allow this insult to stand. Ortega hesitated, then spoke cautiously. Mr. President, I'm not suggesting inaction. But if we rush into war unprepared, we may lose everything. Perhaps we should reach out to our allies in Europe for support before making any rash decisions. Velázquez leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in thought. Well, do both. Begin diplomatic efforts, immediately reach out to Spain and France. But at the same time, I want our military mobilized. Ramirez must reinforce his position near the border, and we need to prepare for a prolonged conflict if necessary. Yes, Mr. President, Ortega said, bowing slightly before leaving the room. Velázquez turned to Ibarra. Send word to Ramirez. Tell him to hold his ground and prepare for reinforcements. This fight is far from over. Back in Amarathia, President Clay's office was a hive of activity as his top officials gathered around the conference table. Secretary of Defense Jonathan Graves spoke first, his tone measured but urgent. Mr. President, we have a clear provocation here. Grand Colombian forces initiated an unprovoked attack on our troops and civilians. This cannot go unanswered. Secretary of State Eleanor Moore, seated beside Graves, nodded in agreement. I've already begun drafting a formal condemnation to send to the Grand Colombian government. But words alone won't be enough. We need to demonstrate that there are consequences for their actions. Clay leaned forward, his hands clasped together on the table. What kind of consequences are we talking about? Graves answered immediately. We recommend deploying additional troops to Panama, both to secure the canal site and to send a clear message to Gran Colombia. At the same time, we should position our navy along their coastline to enforce a blockade if necessary. Moore added, we should also reach out to our allies. If this escalates into a broader conflict, we'll need international support. Clay nodded slowly, considering their advice. What's the risk of escalation? If we move more troops into Panama, won't that provoke them further? Graves didn't hesitate. It's a risk, sir, but if we don't respond decisively, they'll see it as a sign of weakness. They'll keep pushing, and the situation will only get worse. Clay sighed, rubbing his temples. He hated the idea of sending more soldiers into harm's way, but he knew Graves was right. All right, he said finally. Begin preparations for troop deployments, and Eleanor, I want that condemnation on my desk within the hour. Yes, Mr. President, Moore said, gathering her papers. As the meeting ended and the officials began to file out, Clay turned to Harrington. This isn't just about Panama anymore, he said quietly. This is about our reputation as a global power. If we back down now, I'll embolden every rival we have. Harrington nodded. You're absolutely right, sir. But we need to handle this carefully. A war with Gran Colombia could drag on for years. Clay's jaw tightened. Then we'd better make sure it doesn't come to that. The tension between the two nations was palpable as messages and orders flew back and forth. In Bogotá, Velázquez's government worked to rally support for their cause, portraying Amarathia as an imperial aggressor. In Amarathia, Clay prepared to address the nation, determined to unite the public behind his decision to stand firm in Panama. Both leaders knew the stakes. The conflict in Panama was no longer just about a canal, it had become a test of national pride and power. And with both sides refusing to back down, the world braced for the storm that was about to break. Chapter 167. The sun blazed overhead as Matthew Hesh sat in the temporary office set up near the canal construction site. Stacks of blueprints, logistical reports, and survey maps cluttered the desk in front of him, but his mind was elsewhere. The tension in the camp had grown unbearable since the skirmish with Gran Colombian forces. Workers kept glancing over their shoulders, wary of another attack, and the Amarathian troops stationed nearby were visibly on edge. Amber entered the room, her face drawn with worry. Matthew, we need to talk, she said softly. Before Matthew could respond, a soldier entered, carrying a sealed envelope. Mr. Hesh, this just came in from the White House. It's marked urgent. Matthew took the envelope, his heart sinking as he recognized the presidential seal. Breaking it open, he read the letter, his expression growing grimmer with each passing sentence. Mr. Hesh, in light of recent escalations in Panama and the continued aggression of the Gran Colombian Republic, I am declaring the Canal region a war zone, effective immediately. All civilian personnel, including engineers, workers, and their families, are to evacuate the area. Your safety and the safety of your team are of utmost importance. Amarathian troops will assist in the evacuation process to ensure your swift and secure departure. Furthermore, the Great Amarathian Republic has officially declared war on the Gran Colombian Republic. Measures are being taken to secure Amarathian interests in the region. Do not delay. Respectfully, Theodore Clay, President of the Great Amarathian Republic. Matthew set the letter down, his hands trembling slightly. Amber reached out, her eyes scanning his face. What does it say? He exhaled deeply. The president has declared war on Gran Colombia. We're being ordered to evacuate immediately. This place is going to become a battlefield. Amber's face paled, but she nodded. We need to tell the others. Matthew stood, folding the letter and slipping it into his pocket. Let's gather everyone. This isn't a request, it's a direct order. The camp was a flurry of activity as Matthew addressed the engineers, workers, and Amarathian soldiers. His voice was steady, but the gravity of the situation was clear. Your journey continues at Novelbin. Calm, ladies and gentlemen, he began. We've received official word from the White House. The Canal region has been declared a war zone and we're under orders to evacuate immediately. Troops will escort us to the nearest port where transport ships are waiting. The murmurs of concern rippled through the crowd. One of the engineers, Victor Lachance, stepped forward. What about the equipment? The blueprints? Everything we've worked on. Matthew shook his head. We can't take everything. Prioritize the essential, the documents, the designs. Leave the heavy equipment. Our lives are more important than any machine. The workers and engineers scrambled to pack their belongings while Amarathian soldiers maintained a protective perimeter. Amber moved quickly, helping organize the evacuation and ensuring no one was left behind. The group piled into trucks and jeeps, leaving the once bustling construction site behind. As they rumbled toward the port, the jungle seemed to close in around them, the oppressive heat and humidity making the journey even more grueling. Finally, the convoy reached the coast, where ships bearing the Amarathian flag awaited them. Soldiers ushered the evacuees aboard, and as the ships pulled away from the dock, Matthew stood on the deck, watching Panama fade into the horizon. Amber joined him, placing a hand on his arm. Welcome back, she said, her voice firm. This isn't the end of the canal. Matthew nodded, though his gaze remained fixed on the disappearing shoreline. No, it's not the end, but it's going to get worse before it gets better. Back in the Oval Office, President Theodore Clay sat at the head of a long table, flanked by his top military advisors and cabinet members. The atmosphere was tense, but Clay's resolve was unwavering. Is the operation ready? Clay asked, his piercing gaze fixed on General Jonathan Graves. Yes, Mr. President, Graves replied. Hesh Industries has provided the bombers and they're being outfitted as we speak. The crews are experienced and the mission parameters are clear. Well, strike Bogota directly. Secretary of State Eleanor Moore leaned forward, her brow furrowed. Mr. President, this is a significant escalation. An air raid on the Grand Colombian capital could provoke retaliation we're not prepared for. Clay's expression hardened. Eleanor, they attacked our people. They killed our civilians. This isn't escalation, it's justice. Bogota is their center of command. If we hit them hard enough, they'll think twice about continuing this war. Graves nodded. The bombers will target military installations, government buildings, and key infrastructure. The goal is to cripple their ability to coordinate and supply their forces in Panama. Clay stood, his hands resting on the table. Then proceed, launch the operation tonight. I want Bogota to know that Amarathia will not be pushed around. As night fell, a squadron of sleek, silver bombers bearing the insignia of Hesh Industries roared down the runway of an Amarathian airbase. The engines hummed with deadly precision as the aircraft lifted into the sky, their payloads loaded with high-explosive ordnance. The lead bomber's pilot, Captain Daniel Hawthorne, adjusted his headset. Command, this is Eagle 1, we're en route to the target. Estimated arrival in 2 hours. Roger that, Eagle 1, came the reply from the control tower. Proceed as planned, good luck. The flight to Bogota was uneventful, the bombers cruising high above the cloud cover. Below them, the sprawling jungles and mountains of Gran Colombia stretched out in shadowy relief. As they neared the capital, the bombers descended, breaking through the clouds to reveal the city below. The lights of Bogota twinkled like stars, a stark contrast to the destruction about to rain down. Target acquired, Hawthorne said, his voice steady. All units, prepare to drop payloads. One by one, the bombers released their bombs. The first explosion lit up the city, followed by another, and another. Government buildings crumbled under the impact. Roads were torn apart, and the air filled with smoke and fire. The sound of the explosions echoed across the city, a deafening reminder of Amarathia's might. From his vantage point in the presidential palace, Mariano Velázquez watched in horror as the city burned. His hands clenched into fists, his face pale with fury. This is war, he muttered, his voice shaking. They'll pay for this. Chapter 168. The morning after the devastating air raid on Bogota was eerily quiet. Smoke hung heavy over the city, blotting out the rising sun. The once bustling capital of Gran Colombia now resembled a war-torn battlefield. Streets were littered with rubble and debris. The remains of government buildings lay in ruins, and the acrid smell of burning wood and steel filled the air. Survivors wandered aimlessly, their faces streaked with soot and tears, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and fear. In the presidential palace, or what was left of it, President Mariano Velázquez stood in what had once been his office now. The walls were scorched black, the windows blown out, and the grand desk splintered into fragments. Velázquez, his face pale but his eyes burning with fury, turned to his gathered cabinet and military advisors. The group was smaller than usual. Several key officials had perished in the bombing, their absence a glaring reminder of the attacks. Velázquez's voice was low and cold, cutting through the heavy silence. What were those things? General Rodrigo Ibarra, his uniform stained with soot and his arm in a hastily applied sling, stepped forward. His face was lined with exhaustion, but his tone was firm. Mr. President, our intelligence is still gathering details, but from what we've pieced together, they were flying machines, bombers, unlike anything we've ever seen. Velázquez slammed his hand onto the remains of the desk, his anger finally breaking through. Flying steel machines that rained fire and death upon our city. How could we not have known about this? How could our intelligence have failed so spectacularly? Felipe Ortega, the foreign minister, cleared his throat nervously. Mr. President, Amarathia's technological advancements have always been a closely guarded secret. It appears they have taken their partnership with Hesh Industries to unprecedented heights. These bombers, they are a new weapon of war, one we were unprepared for. Velázquez's gaze bore into Ortega, his voice dripping with venom. Unprepared? Is that supposed to excuse this disaster? Our capital is in ruins. Our people are terrified, and Amarathia thinks they can get away with this. Ortega hesitated, then replied cautiously, "We must act carefully. Mr. President, Amarathia has clearly demonstrated its technological superiority. If we retaliate recklessly, we may provoke further attacks." Velasquez clenched his fists, his knuckles white. "And if we do nothing, they'll see us as weak. This is not just about Bogotá, this is about the survival of Gran Colombia. We cannot allow Amarathia to dictate the terms of this war." General Ibarra stepped forward again, his expression grim. "Mr. President, our current military capabilities are no match for those bombers, our anti-air defenses are outdated, and we lack the resources to develop countermeasures quickly. We must secure support from our allies, Spain, France, even Britain. If we can rally them to our side, we might stand a chance." Velasquez's anger simmered, but he nodded slowly. "You're right. We cannot fight this war alone, Ortega. Send urgent messages to our ambassadors in Europe. Emphasize the Amarathian aggression and the destruction of our capital. Make them see that this is not just our fight, but a battle against imperialist tyranny." "Yes, Mr. President," Ortega said. Bowing slightly before leaving the room, Velasquez turned back to Ibarra. "And you, General, begin reorganizing our forces. I want every available unit mobilized and our defenses strengthened. If Amarathia dares to attack us again, they will find us ready." Ibarra saluted, his injured arm making the movement stiff. "It will be done, Mr. President." As Velasquez's government scrambled to respond, the people of Bogotá struggled to cope with the aftermath. Hospitals were overwhelmed with the injured. Their halls echoing with the cries of the wounded. Volunteers worked tirelessly to clear rubble and provide aid, their faces grim with determination. Among the survivors was a young boy, no older than 10, who clutched a tattered doll as he sat on the steps of what had once been his home. His wide, tear-filled eyes stared at the sky, as if expecting the flying machines to return at any moment. An older woman approached him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "They won't come back, Niño," she said softly, though her own voice trembled. "Not today." But deep down, the people of Bogotá knew the truth. Amarathia had proven its might, and the war was far from over. Back in the Amarathian capital, President Theodore Clay reviewed the reports of the air raid with a sense of grim satisfaction. The mission had been a success. Bogotá was in chaos, its government reeling, and Amarathia had sent a clear message. Their technological superiority was unmatched. As Clay addressed his cabinet, his tone was resolute. "This war will not drag on," he declared. "Gran Colombia now knows what they're up against. If they have any sense, they'll back down." Eleanor Moore, the Secretary of State, leaned forward, her expression cautious. "And if they don't, Mr. President, what's our next move?" Clay's gaze was steely. "Then we continue to strike. This isn't just about Panama, it's about securing our place as a global power. We cannot afford to show weakness." Jonathan Graves nodded in agreement. "The bombers are ready for additional missions, sir. If Gran Colombia refuses to surrender, we'll cripple them piece by piece." Clay turned to his military advisors. "Begin preparations for a follow-up strike. Target their supply lines, their military infrastructure. If they want war, we'll give them war. Stay connected via Novelbin." Calm as his advisors dispersed to carry out his orders, Clay remained seated, his mind racing. He knew the risks of escalation, but he also knew the stakes. This was no longer just about the Panama Canal, it was about the future of Amarathian dominance, and he was determined to ensure that future, no matter the cost. As the Amarathian war machine roared into motion, preparations for the next wave of strikes unfolded with cold efficiency. In Gran Colombia, Velasquez convened his generals, desperate to devise a strategy to counter the flying steel that had decimated his capital. Chapter 169. The tension in what remained of the presidential palace was suffocating. President Mariano Velasquez sat at the head of the War Council, his gaze locked onto the battered map of his country. The Amarathian air raid had devastated Bogotá, but it had done more than just destroy buildings. It had exposed Gran Colombia's military vulnerability to the entire world. General Rodrigo Ibarra stood beside the map, tracing a line with his finger. His uniform was stained with soot, and the bandage on his arm, From the previous day's attack was still fresh. Mr. President, we can no longer ignore the reality of this war. Amarathia's bombers have changed everything. We can't even take down those aircraft as we don't have a weapon to counter it. The Amarathians would surely use their flying steel to drop their bombs, leaving us with no choice but to catch them with our bare hands. The room was silent, save for the occasional crackling of distant fires still burning through the city above them. The ministers and military officials exchanged uneasy glances, none willing to be the first to speak. Velasquez finally broke the silence. Then we must find a way. We cannot allow Amarathia to dictate the outcome of this war from the skies. If we don't stop them now, there will be nothing left of Gran Colombia. But how, Mr. President? Defense Minister Enrique Salazar asked. His voice was heavy with exhaustion. We have no aircraft, no defenses against bombers, no industry capable of producing countermeasures on short notice. Our army is built for ground warfare, not this. Ibarra exhaled sharply. That's why we need foreign support. We need weapons that can reach them, cannons capable of striking high-altitude targets, anything that can threaten their flying machines. If we cannot build them, we must buy them. Not even foreign nations have those technologies, only Amarathia. This is a new war, and those foreign nations would simply watch and learn. Velasquez's fingers dug into the edge of the table as he listened to Ibarra's grim assessment. The truth was hard to swallow, but there was no denying it. This was a new kind of war, one where Amarathia dictated the battlefield from above. He exhaled sharply. So you're telling me no nation has an answer to those machines? Felipe Ortega, the foreign minister, shook his head. Not yet, Mr. President. They've seen the power of Amarathia's bombers and they are watching, but they won't act not until they understand how to counter them. They see this war as an opportunity to observe, not to intervene. Enrique Salazar, the defense minister, leaned forward. Then we are alone in this. We have nothing that can shoot them down, no way to stop their raids. Amarathia can bomb us into submission at will. A heavy silence fell over the room. The officials looked at one another, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. For the first time in decades, Gran Colombia was truly defenseless. Velasquez's expression darkened. He refused to accept defeat. His country would not fall without a fight. If we cannot shoot them down, then we must make bombing us too costly. His voice was firm. We fortify every key city. We make it hell for their troops on the ground. They may own the skies, but they will never own our land. Ibarra gave a slow nod. Urban warfare, if they invade, we make them bleed for every street, every building. We force them into a war they do not want. Salazar frowned. That could take months, even years. Our people will suffer. Velasquez's jaw tightened. They already are. He looked around the room. Do you all believe Amarathia will stop after Panama? Do you think they will stop once they've shattered our economy and burned our cities? No, they will not stop until we are broken beyond repair. The room remained silent. We must act now, he continued. The people need to see that Gran Colombia is still standing. We will spread resistance across the country. Every town, every village will be ready to fight. Ibarra straightened. Then we must mobilize immediately. If we cannot fight them in the air, we will fight them in the streets. As Gran Colombia scrambled to prepare for an inevitable invasion, Amarathia was already moving to crush any chance of resistance. Back in Washington, President Theodore Clay received his latest briefing. His advisors had gathered in the war room, standing before a massive map of Gran Colombia. Mr. President, General Jonathan Graves began. Bogota has been shattered, but intelligence suggests Velasquez is doubling down instead of surrendering. He's mobilizing forces for urban resistance. Likely, preparing for prolonged guerrilla warfare. Clay's expression hardened. We cannot allow that to happen. How soon can we launch another strike? The bombers are ready, sir, the commander replied. We can hit their industrial centers next, factories, railways, and their last major supply hubs. If we cut them off completely, they won't be able to fight at all. Clay nodded. Then do it, no half measures. Make sure Gran Colombia knows that resistance is futile. The order was given. Within hours, dozens of Amarathian bombers were in the air once more, their engines roaring as they flew toward their next targets, the industrial hubs of Medellin and Cali. As the people of Medellin went about their daily routines, the ominous hum of aircraft engines filled the sky. At first, no one understood what was coming. Then the first bomb fell. Explosions rocked the city, tearing through factories, railways, and supply depots. Entire streets were engulfed in fire. Within seconds, the screams of civilians filled the air as buildings crumbled, burying families beneath the rubble. In Cali, the story was much the same. The bombers struck with merciless precision, turning once thriving industrial centers into smoldering wastelands. Velázquez, still in Bogotá, received the reports with a face like stone. The Amorathians were not stopping. They were going to grind Gran Colombia into dust. Velázquez knew the truth. Stay updated through Novelbin. Gran Colombia could not win this war. The industrial base was gone. The people were in terror. The military was outmatched still. He refused to surrender. "This is no longer a war for victory," he muttered, staring out over his broken city. "This is a war for survival." He turned to General Ibarra. "Mobilize what's left of our forces. We make our last stand here." The fate of Gran Colombia hung in the balance, and Amarathia was closing in for the kill. Chapter 170. For the people of Gran Colombia, there was no reprieve. Each dawn brought the same horror, the low hum of Amorathian bombers piercing the morning sky, a sound that now heralded nothing but death and destruction. The bombing campaign had escalated beyond strategic targets. What had started as air raids against factories, railways, and military depots had turned into an unrelenting assault on the nation itself. Amorathia's goal was clear: to break Gran Colombia's will to resist. Bogotá, Medellín, Cali, none had been spared. Each day, new cities and towns were set ablaze. Hospitals, government offices, even marketplaces all crumbled under the relentless barrage. The roads were clogged with refugees, families abandoning their homes in search of safety that no longer existed. In the ruined capital, President Mariano Velázquez sat in his underground command center, his eyes hollow from exhaustion. Reports flooded in from across the nation: devastation, mass casualties, entire battalions wiped out before they could even mount a defense. General Rodrigo Ibarra, his uniform stained with sweat and dust, slammed his fist onto the map table. "This isn't war anymore, Mr. President. This is annihilation." Velázquez barely blinked. He already knew. He had seen the ruins of Bogotá firsthand. The Amorathians were no longer fighting an army. They were destroying a nation each day. The Amorathian Air Force launched wave after wave of bombers. Their payloads were precise, deadly, and unstoppable. Military bases that once housed Gran Colombia's finest troops vanished in fireballs. Supply lines critical to their resistance efforts were obliterated. Communication networks fell silent as radio towers were reduced to twisted metal. The once proud Gran Colombian army was left without food, weapons, or even a way to coordinate their defenses. "We cannot hold them off any longer," Salazar admitted grimly during one of their final war council meetings. "We no longer have an army." But Velázquez refused to yield. "Then we fight as long as we can. If they come for Bogotá, we make them pay for every step they take." But the truth was clear: Amorathia didn't even need to invade. They had no reason to risk their soldiers in street battles when their bombers could destroy entire districts without resistance, and so the bombing continued. The streets of Bogotá, Medellín, and Cartagena became graveyards. Entire neighborhoods were flattened, the air filled with smoke and the cries of the wounded. Hospitals overflowed, but soon even the hospitals became targets. Doctors and nurses worked tirelessly, treating the injured by candlelight until the next bomb strike wiped them out. In the countryside, desperate farmers abandoned their fields. Supply routes had been cut off. Hunger set in. Starving families looted what little food remained in the markets. Riots broke out in cities where the government could no longer maintain control. Each night, survivors lay awake, listening for the dreaded sound of engines above. The bombers came like clockwork. Every day, a new part of their world was erased. By the fourth week of bombardment, Gran Colombia's government could barely function. Velázquez no longer resided in the palace. What was left of it had been bombed into a skeletal ruin. The government operated from a bunker beneath the remnants of the military headquarters, but even that was no longer safe. January 9, 1887, the final blow came. Amorathia unleashed its largest raid yet. 100 bombers descended upon Bogotá, turning the city into an inferno. The presidential bunker shook with each explosion. Velázquez and his remaining officials braced themselves as the walls cracked, dust falling from the ceiling. Ibarra, gripping a rifle, turned to the president. "This is the end." Salazar wiped the sweat from his face. "We can't take another day of this. If we don't surrender, there will be nothing left." Velázquez closed his eyes. His heart was heavy, but he knew he had sworn to fight until the last, but there was no one left to fight with. He nodded slowly. On the morning of January 10, 1887, President Velasquez's official surrender was transmitted to the Amorathian embassy. The message was short, but it marked the end of the war on the morning of January 10, 1891. President Velasquez's official surrender was transmitted to the Amorathian embassy. The message was short, but it marked the end of the war. The Republic of Gran Colombia concedes to the superior forces of Amorathia. We request immediate cessation of hostilities and terms for peace. The war was over. The skies above Bogotá fell silent for the first time in weeks. No more bombers, no more explosions, only silence and the smoldering ruins of a once proud nation. Back in Washington, President Theodore Clay stood before Congress, his face unreadable as he delivered the final declaration: Amorathia has triumphed. The war is over. The chamber erupted into applause. The world had witnessed the dawn of a new kind of warfare, and Amorathia had proven itself the sole master of the skies. Clay turned to General Graves: prepare the occupation forces. Gran Colombia is ours now. The empire of Amorathia had risen. Find your adventure at Novelbin. Matthew Hesch sat in his study, sipping a cup of coffee while reviewing the latest engineering reports from Hesch Industries. The war had kept him occupied, but now, with the fighting over, there was something else on his mind. The canal. A sharp knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Amber entered, carrying a sealed envelope with the official presidential insignia on the front. It's from the White House, she said, handing it to him. Matthew's stomach tightened as he carefully broke the seal and unfolded the letter. Mr. Hesch, the war is over. Gran Colombia has officially surrendered to the great Amorathian Republic. The government in Bogotá has fallen, and our occupation forces are already en route to ensure stability in the region. As of today, January 11, 1891, the Panama Canal project will resume under full Amorathian authority. We will require your expertise in rebuilding and fortifying our new holdings. The war has proven the necessity of controlling this region indefinitely. Your presence is expected in Washington for a formal briefing. Your nation thanks you for your service. Respectfully, Theodore Clay, President of the Great Amorathian Republic. Matthew exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. It's over, he muttered.